There are rooms that know what they are holding before the people inside them do. Frank Dolan's office was that kind of room. It sat on the second floor of a narrow brick building on Claiborne Street, in the kind of small Tennessee county seat where the courthouse still had a working clock tower. And the same three families had owned the same land for 100 years. The office smelled of old paper and floor wax and the particular stillness that settles into a place where difficult things are said, quietly and often. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. The Venetian blinds were drawn against the afternoon glare, and the light that came through them fell in pale stripes across the long conference table, across the water glasses. No one had touched across the hands of the people sitting around it. Edna Marsh sat at the far end of the table with her purse on her lap and her hands folded over it. She had chosen that seat deliberately, the way she had learned to choose most things in this family, carefully, without drawing attention to the choice itself. She was 64 years old. Her hair had gone silver at the temples, and she wore it pulled back, not because it was fashionable, but because it kept it out of her face, and she had never had the patience for things that needed tending every hour. She wore a dark blue dress she had pressed the night before, and low shoes she could walk in, and she had driven herself to the attorney's office because no one had thought to offer, and asking would have made it into something that required gratitude. Across the table, Glenn Marsh sat, with his jacket still on, and one arm draped over the back of the chair beside him, the way a man sits when he wants to communicate that the room belongs to him. He was 55 and broad through the shoulders, and he had the Marsh jaw, that particular set to the chin that Harold had carried too, though Harold had never used it the same way. Glenn used it like punctuation, like a period at the end of every sentence that wasn't technically a question, but expected agreement anyway. Beside Glenn sat Patrice. Patrice Marsh was 52, and she wore a cream-colored blouse and a bracelet that caught the light each time she moved her wrist, which was often. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had decided long ago that composure was a form of superiority, and she maintained it the way some people maintain a garden, with constant quiet effort and the occasional removal of anything that threatened to grow outside the intended shape. At the other end of Glenn's side of the table, Colt Marsh sat with his phone face down in front of him. He was 30 and he had his father's build, but not yet his father's certainty. And there was something in the way he sat, shoulders slightly forward, jaw slightly loose, that suggested a person waiting for instructions he had not quite received. Frank Dolan sat at the head of the table with a manila folder open in front of him, and his reading glasses pushed up into his hair. He was a deliberate man, the kind who chose his words the way a carpenter chooses a board, turning it over, checking the grain, making sure it would hold. He had been Harold Marsh's attorney for 11 years. There were two other cousins in the room, men in their 40s whose names Edna always remembered correctly, and whose faces she had learned to read over 22 years of Marsh family gatherings. They sat together near the window and spoke to each other in low voices, and tried to look like they were not calculating. Frank Dolan cleared his throat and opened the folder. He did not rush. He read the document the way it was meant to be read, which is to say, clearly, without editorializing, without softening the language to suit the audience. Harold Marsh had spent considerable time on this document. It deserved to be read as written. The early provisions were expected. A modest savings account divided among certain relatives. personal property and tools to be distributed as listed in a separate attachment. The truck to Glenn. Glenn received that item with a small nod as if he had known it was coming, which perhaps he had. Then Frank Dolan reached the property, the house and land at 4 Stone Creek Road, Monroe County, Tennessee. The full parcel as described in the deed of record, including the structure, all outbuildings, the timber rights attached to the upper acreage, the water rights recorded in the county register, and all easements, road access agreements, and legal attachments running with the land. Dolan read all of it. He did not skip the legal language. He read road access, water rights, timber rights, recorded attachments. He said that all of it transferred as written to Edna Louise Marsh. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the thing that was expected turns out not to be the thing that arrives. Glenn's arm came off the back of the chair. It was a small movement, the kind a person makes unconsciously when something shifts under them. He straightened in his seat, and his jaw tightened. And for just a moment before the expression he intended arrived, his face showed something unguarded. Not grief, not surprise in the ordinary sense, something more specific than that. Something that looked to Edna, who had spent 22 years watching this man's face from the edges of family gatherings, like a calculation running very fast and arriving at a number it did not expect. Then Glenn laughed. It was a brief laugh, low and dismissive, the kind that is meant to communicate that what has just been said is too small to be taken seriously. He looked sideways at Patrice, and Patrice's expression arranged itself into something gentle and sorrowful, the way a person arranges flowers over something they want to cover. One of the cousins made a sound near the window. Not quite a word, just a sound. Edna sat with her hands folded over her purse and did not move. Frank Dolan continued. He was describing the attachment of a recorded access easement that ran across the rear of the Stone Creek parcel. He was using careful, flat, legal language, the kind that does not editorialize, the kind that trusts the listener to understand the weight of what is being said. Road access, recorded easement, legal attachments running with the land. Glenn stopped laughing. He stopped so completely and so suddenly that the absence of it had its own sound. His eyes moved to Frank Dolan's folder, not to Edna. Not to the table, to the folder, to the papers inside it. His expression did not change, but his attention changed, and Edna felt the shift in the room the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. He had heard something in those words that mattered. She did not know yet what it was, but she marked it. Frank Dolan reached into the folder and placed 2 items on the table. The first was a small brass key on a plain ring, old, scratched on one side, lighter than it looked. The second was an envelope. It was not office stationery. It was not crisp or white or new. It was an old yellow envelope softened at the corners, the way paper softens when it has been handled, and set down and handled again over a long time. On the front, in Harold Marsh's handwriting, careful and slightly uneven the way his handwriting always was, Edna's full name was written, and beneath her name 7 words, "Open this when you reach the house." Glenn was looking at the envelope. Edna picked it up before anyone else could speak. She placed it inside her purse beside the key and pressed the clasp shut, and did not look at Glenn or Patrice or either of the cousins near the window. Frank Dolan said that the property transferred as written and that all recorded attachments would be provided in documentation available to Mrs. Marsh upon request. He asked if there were questions. Patrice asked in a voice that sounded like concern whether Edna had given any thought to how she would manage a property in that condition, whether she had consulted anyone about the cost of maintaining land like that. Edna looked at her. Patrice was wearing the kind of expression that people wear when they want to appear to be asking a question, but are actually making a statement. Her bracelet caught the light. Glenn said nothing. He was watching Frank Dolan's folder. Then he looked at Edna's purse. One of the cousins said something quiet to the other, a short phrase, private. Colt had not looked up from the table. Edna thanked Frank Dolan. She stood, straightened her dress, picked up her purse, and walked to the door. She did not hurry. She did not pause. She did not look back at the room behind her. At the top of the staircase, she could hear Glenn's voice starting behind her. Lower, now directed toward Dolan. She did not stop to listen. She walked down the stairs and through the front door and out into the afternoon. The parking lot behind the building was half empty. A mockingbird was making a sound in the oak tree near the far corner. A complicated, layered sound. Not its own, but a collection of everything it had heard and decided to keep. Edna stood beside her car for a moment, with her hand resting on the door handle, and let herself breathe the outside air. Her hand did not tremble. She noted that the way she had learned to note things quietly without making too much of it. Then she got in and drove south. The drive from Claiborne Street to Stone Creek Road was 40 minutes on a good day. Less if you caught the light at Tilford Crossing, and more if the county road had taken new damage from the fall rains, which it usually had by November. Edna had made the drive often enough to know every bend, every place where the gravel gave way to cracked asphalt, every stand of trees where the road narrowed, and you had to trust that no one was coming the other direction. She did not turn on the radio. The envelope was on the passenger seat. She had taken it from her purse and set it there. Not to read it, she would not open it until she reached the house. Harold had asked her that, and she intended to honor it, but so she could see it. So she could be sure of it. The key rested in the cup holder. Edna drove. The town gave way to the outer edges of itself. The gas station, the dollar store, the small brick church with the reader board sign out front that changed its message every few weeks. Then the road began to open. Fields appeared. Fences leaned into long ditches at the margins. Houses sat farther and farther apart until they were only shapes behind tree lines and long driveways. Private in the way that rural things are private, not hidden exactly, just not offering themselves. She had made this drive for 22 years. She had made it with casseroles in the passenger seat and medicine in a paper bag on the floor, and more times than anyone had ever asked about. With nothing at all, just herself, and the willingness to show up when Harold's health was bad, and the house needed someone in it who would not treat him like a problem to be managed from a comfortable distance. The Marsh family called themselves close. They had a talent for performing closeness. At Christmas, they gathered and took photographs and said the right things about missing people who were no longer there. Glenn organized the gathering each year and stood at the center of it with the satisfaction of a man who had decided he was the reason the thing existed. Patrice arranged the food and the seating and directed conversations away from anything that might introduce friction. Edna had stood at those gatherings and helped and smiled and cleaned up afterward, and driven Harold home when he was tired, which, in recent years, had been early. She had not been in a single photograph. She did not think about this with bitterness. She had stopped being bitter about the Marsh family a long time ago, because bitterness required a kind of hope, a belief that the thing could be different. If you just waited long enough or made yourself understood. And she had used that hope up carefully over the years, and had learned to invest what remained of her patience in things that might actually change. She had changed things quietly. The medication schedule Harold could not keep himself. The back porch step that would have put him on the ground eventually. The furnace filter she replaced without being asked because no one else was going to ask. The Wednesday afternoons, she drove 40 minutes each way to sit with him in his kitchen and drink bad coffee from the chip mug she had bought him at the church rummage sale, because he had complained his coffee tasted like metal. None of it had been loud. None of it had been acknowledged. Now there was an envelope on the passenger seat with her name on it in Harold's handwriting. She turned onto Stone Creek Road at the old billboard that had been advertising the same insurance company since before she was married. The gravel crunched under the tires. The trees thickened on both sides. Then the mailbox appeared at the edge of the drive, old black metal faded to gray, tilted slightly toward the ditch. The name Marsh still readable if you knew to look. The house appeared beyond the gate. She had forgotten, or perhaps she had simply not allowed herself to remember how small it looked when you saw it all at once. The tin roof patched in 3 places with newer metal that had not yet weathered to match. The siding gray from seasons of rain and sun thin at the corners where it had given the most ground. The porch dipping at the right-hand end where the support post had shifted not dangerously but noticeably the way things shift when they have been left to manage alone. Behind the house, the land ran back toward a tree line, a long slope of rough grass and dormant weeds that dissolved into shadow. Where the trees began, a feed shed stood at the left edge of the yard, low and rusted brush pressed against one side. Beyond everything, the ridge was visible, dark green and patient, standing the way it had always stood. Glenn had called this place an anchor around her neck. He had not used those exact words. He had used words that meant the same thing. Edna pushed the gate open. It scraped across the ground with a dry, reluctant sound, the same sound it had always made. She drove through and parked close to the house. The air outside the car was cold and smelled of wet leaves and the particular mineral stillness that comes off land that has been undisturbed for a while. She stood beside the car for a moment and looked at the house the way you look at a thing you need to understand before you go inside it. Then she went in. The house smelled of closed rooms and old wood, and something beneath both of those that she recognized without being able to name. Not neglect, exactly. Presence, maybe. The compressed presence of a person who had lived in a space for a long time and left traces of themselves in the air and the objects and the particular arrangement of things that no one else would have arranged that way. She opened the front curtains. Pale afternoon light moved across the floorboards, across the furniture, across the kitchen doorway, and into the front room where Harold's chair still sat, facing the window the way he had positioned it in the last years when he wanted to watch the yard without having to go out in it. The chair was empty. Edna stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Then she went to the kitchen. The chipped blue mug was still beside the sink. She had bought it at the church rummage sale on Tillman Street for 75 cents. and presented it to Harold on a Wednesday afternoon in February, when he had repeated for the third time that his coffee tasted like something had died in the percolator. He had turned it over in his hands, looked at the small chip on the rim said it would do, and used it every single morning after that, until the morning he could not. She touched the handle with one finger. On the wall beside the back door, the calendar still hung. A utility company calendar. 12 months of Tennessee landscape photographs, practical and unlovely. November showed a photograph of Reelfoot Lake at Sunrise Flat, and silver and still. In the square for the 17th, written in her own handwriting, were the words, Knoxville, Baptist Memorial, 9:15. She stood and looked at those words. No one in the Marsh family had ever asked about that appointment. Not before it happened, and not after. Glenn had called Harold twice that week, she knew, because Harold had told her. And both calls had been about the fence line on the south pasture of the family property, 2 counties over a piece of land that had been in dispute with a neighbor for 6 years, and that Glenn considered more urgently requiring of Harold's attention than Harold's own oncology calendar. She lowered her hand. Harold had gone to that appointment alone. She had driven him. She sat at the kitchen table and took the envelope from her purse. Her name on the front of it in Harold's uneven hand looked exactly the way his handwriting had always looked. He had never been a man with elegant handwriting. He had written the way he did most things, practically without ornamentation, with the intention of being understood rather than admired. But his letters were recognizable and they were his, and she sat with them for a moment before she picked up the small key. The key was darker than the house key, old and narrow with a strip of masking tape wrapped around the bow. On the tape, in Harold's handwriting, 2 words, Feed Shed. She set the key on the table beside the envelope. She could see the shed through the kitchen window, low, rusted, half obscured by the brush that had grown up along its near side over the past several years. She had walked past that shed perhaps 200 times. Harold had never asked her to go inside it, had never mentioned it except once years ago when he said something about keeping the old tractor equipment out of the weather, and she had not thought about it since. She picked up the envelope. She opened it carefully, working the flap loose with 2 fingers rather than tearing it the way her mother had taught her, which was a way of respecting what was inside. There was 1 sheet of paper. Harold's handwriting again slightly more cramped than usual, the letters closer together near the bottom of the page, where he had been reaching the end of what he had to say. She spread it flat on the table and began to read. The letter was not long. Harold had never been a man who padded things. He said what he meant, and he stopped when he was finished. And this letter was consistent with the man who had written it. He began without salutation. No, dear Edna, no opening that required him to decide how to frame what he was going to say. He simply started. He wrote that he knew the family had never treated her as though she belonged to it. He wrote that he had watched this for years and had said less than he should have said. And he had no excuse for that, except that he was the kind of man who moved slowly toward confrontation, which was perhaps a character flaw, and perhaps just the way God had assembled him. And he was not going to pretend otherwise now. He wrote that he saw the groceries and the clinic rides and the soup and the Wednesday afternoons, and he knew that none of them had been acknowledged by the people who should have acknowledged them. He wrote that he wanted her to know he had seen all of it, every last bit of it, and that it had not gone unregistered. Edna stopped reading for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet around her. The old refrigerator made its low working sound. Outside, something moved briefly in the brush at the edge of the yard. A bird or a small animal, and was still again. She went back to the letter. Harold wrote about the house. He wrote that he knew it looked like a burden from the outside. He knew what the family would say. He had already imagined Glenn's expression when Frank Dolan read the will, and he wrote that the imagining had given him something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the neighborhood of it. Then he wrote Glenn brought a man from a land company to this house 14 months ago. Edna read that line twice. He wrote that he had not given the man the meeting he came for. He had sat across from him in this kitchen in the chair Edna was sitting in now, and he had listened to the man explain what Ridgeline Development would like to do with the Stone Creek parcel, and what they believed it to be worth, and how smoothly and quickly the transaction could proceed. He had listened to all of it without interrupting because Harold Marsh was a man who believed you let a person finish before you responded, even when the response was going to be no. The response had been no. The man had left. Glenn had stood on the porch afterward and told Harold he was being foolish, that the offer was generous, that the land wasn't doing anything useful. Just sitting there, that Harold was letting sentiment get in the way of common sense. Harold had told Glenn to go home. Then Harold wrote the sentence that changed the shape of everything else in the room. Glenn kept the man's card, and if he comes asking about the road, he is not asking about the road. Edna set the letter down on the table. She looked through the kitchen window at the feed shed. The padlock on the door caught a small angle of light through the trees, a brief glint of metal, and then the light shifted, and it was gone. She picked the letter up again and read to the end. Harold wrote that everything he was leaving her was because she showed up. Not because of obligation, not because of the law, because she had been the person who appeared when a person was needed and had not required recognition as the price of her presence. He wrote that this was rarer than she might think. He wrote that he had lived long enough to understand the difference between people who said they cared and people who drove 40 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon to sit in a cold kitchen because someone else was lonely. The last line was this: everything I left is yours because you show up. You always did. Edna sat with the letter for a long time. Then she folded it carefully along its original crease and placed it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her purse. She picked up the small feed shed key and held it in her palm for a moment. Then she went to the window and looked at the shed. She would go out there, but not yet. First, she wanted to understand what she was walking toward. She put on the old pair of work gloves she found under the sink, the ones she had bought Harold 2 Christmases ago, for the same reason she bought him most things, because they were practical, and he needed them and no one else had thought to. And she stepped out the back door into the cold afternoon. She crossed the yard slowly. The grass was wet near the tree line, and the ground gave slightly under her shoes. The shed sat at the far left edge of the yard, rust along the roof line, the brush grown up close along the east wall. The padlock hung at the front hasp, old and heavy. She had seen it before in the way you see things you pass regularly, without examining as a fixture a background detail. She examined it now. The lock was old. The metal was dull with oxidation, the particular gray-brown of iron that has been exposed to weather for years without attention. She leaned in. The scratches were around the keyhole, not old scratches, not the kind that accumulate slowly over years of ordinary use. These were bright. The metal beneath them still showed its true color, lighter than the surface around it, not yet darkened by exposure. Someone had been at this lock with something narrow, a pick, a small tool working at the keyhole with focused intent. And they had not been at it long ago. Days, maybe. She stood up and looked at the ground. The soil near the shed door was soft from recent rain. There, pressed into the earth, pointing toward the lock, was a boot print, large. The tread distinct, the edges still sharp. Someone had stood exactly here. Edna stood and looked at the print for a long time. She looked at the road. She looked at the gate. She looked at the marsh mailbox, faded and tilted, and beyond it the empty length of Stone Creek Road running away toward the county highway. Then she looked at the shed key in her hand. She did not open the shed. She was not afraid exactly, but she understood, with the particular understanding that comes from years of watching people operate in the margins of what they will admit, that she was not the only person who had come to this property recently. And whoever had come before her had come for something inside this shed and had not gotten it. That changed what she needed to do next. She went back inside and locked the kitchen door behind her. The phone rang at a few minutes past noon. Edna had moved to the front room. She had opened the window curtains fully and was sitting in a chair near the window. Not Harold's chair, the smaller one beside it. And she was looking at the yard when the phone buzzed on the table beside her. Patrice. She let it ring twice. The ringtone was the default tone, the one that came with the phone, because Edna had never seen the point of spending energy on that particular form of personalization. The phone rang with its default tone twice, and she watched the yard and thought about what she knew and what she still needed to know. And then she answered. Patrice's voice came through warm and practiced. The kind of warmth that is assembled rather than arrived at, the way a set is assembled before a performance. She asked how Edna was doing after the morning. She said she knew it had been a lot to absorb. She said that she and Glenn had talked on the drive home and that they were both thinking of her. Edna said she was fine. Patrice asked whether she had had a chance to look through the house, whether she had found it in good condition, whether she had thought about what she was going to do. Edna said she had just arrived. Patrice said that of course there was no rush. No rush at all, but that it might help to have someone who understood property matters take a look at things before she started making decisions. She said Glenn knew the county. He knew the people to call. He would not want her to end up confused by paperwork that was more complicated than it appeared. Edna said the paperwork seemed fairly clear from what she had heard in Frank Dolan's office. Patrice's voice softened in a way that suggested the softness was a technique. She said that yes, of course the basic transfer was straightforward, but there were attachments. Older documents, things that could create obligations and complications she might not be aware of. She said that before Edna went spending money or making commitments, it would be wise to let Glenn review things. Edna said she would keep that in mind. Patrice said they had been thinking that if the property was going to be a burden, the fairest thing, the simplest thing might be for it to come back into the family, naturally, without realtors or strangers walking through. Glenn had spoken with someone and they thought $25,000 was a generous and fair starting place for a conversation. Cash, quick, no complications. $25,000. Edna was quiet for a moment. She was looking through the front window at the yard, the road, the mailbox, the long, empty gravel drive. She said, how much help was Glenn prepared to offer for $25,000? Patrice said it wasn't about help. It was about making sure Edna wasn't overwhelmed by something she hadn't asked for and didn't need. Edna said she hadn't said she didn't need it. Patrice said in a voice that had gone slightly cooler that no one was pressuring her, that this was simply a conversation, and that the offer would be there if Edna decided it was the sensible choice. Edna asked what made Glenn think this land needed to come back to the family. Patrice said it was where it belonged. Edna said she thought Frank Dolan's paperwork suggested otherwise. The silence that followed was short but meaningful. Then Patrice said something about the road. She said there were questions about the road access and what it meant practically, and whether Edna understood the obligations that could come with old recorded easements. Edna kept her voice even. She said, "Which road?" Patrice paused. A small pause, the kind that arrives when something has come out before it was fully dressed. Then she said, the road at the back of the property. The old access line, it was probably nothing, just old paperwork, but Glenn thought it should be looked at before anyone made any decisions. Edna said she agreed things should be understood before decisions were made. She said she would be in touch. She ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. Edna set the phone on the table and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the back wall. She thought about the will reading. She thought about the moment Glenn's arm came off the back of the chair. She thought about the word attachments and the word road. Patrice had mentioned the road before Edna had. She picked up the small notebook she kept in her purse and wrote that down. The time, the exact phrasing. Patrice mentioned the road before I did. Then she looked out the kitchen window toward the shed. The padlock was still there. The scratches were still there, though she could not see them from this distance. The boot print was still in the mud. She was still looking at the shed when she heard the sound. A car door, soft, somewhere beyond the front gate. She did not move immediately. She had learned over many years and in many situations that the first instinct in a moment of uncertainty is not always the right one. The first instinct often comes from fear, and fear is not a reliable navigator. So she sat still for a moment, which felt long and was probably only a few seconds, and she listened. No engine, no voices. Just the one soft sound of a car door closing, not hard, the way you close a door when you do not want to be heard. She moved to the front room. The window there faced the road. She stood to one side of it rather than in front of it and looked out. A truck was parked beyond the Marsh mailbox, pulled to the shoulder of Stone Creek Road, at an angle that allowed the driver to see the house and driveway without being obviously visible from the road. Dark-colored. She could not read the plate from this distance. The windshield caught the angle of the afternoon and gave back only glare. Nothing moved. The truck sat there the way things sit when they are waiting. Not parked. Waiting. Edna stood at the edge of the window and watched it. 1 minute passed. Maybe 2. Then the engine started low and unhurried, and the truck pulled away from the shoulder. Not fast. Pulling onto the road with the deliberate pace of something that is trying not to be remembered. It went north toward the county highway, and in a few moments the sound of it faded around the bend in the trees and was gone. Edna stood at the window for a while longer. Then she went back to the kitchen table and added to her notebook. Dark truck partial view. Pulled off road at angle to watch gate. Did not park. Waited. Left slowly when I came to the window. She looked at the two entries. Patrice mentioned the road before I did. Dark truck watching the gate. She set the pen down and looked out the kitchen window toward the feed shed. She was still sitting at the table when she heard footsteps on the back porch. Not heavy footsteps. Not the footsteps of someone trying to go unheard and failing. These were the footsteps of an older woman with work boots who was not trying to be quiet because she had nothing to hide. The knock that followed was the same unhurried direct. Edna went to the back door. Through the small pane of glass in the upper half, she saw a woman in a faded green coat with the buttons done in the wrong order, gray hair pinned low, and a covered dish held in both hands. She opened the door. Ruth Colby was 70 years old and had lived on Stone Creek Road for 41 years, which meant she had arrived before the Marshes finished the fence on the south boundary, and she had outlasted 3 different configurations of the county road maintenance agreement. And she knew this land the way you know, something you have paid close attention to for 4 decades. Oh. She said she had knocked at the front first. She said she hoped she was not intruding. She said she had made a dish and thought Edna might not have thought about supper yet. Edna stepped back from the door and let her in. Ruth set the covered dish on the counter and looked around the kitchen with the direct, unashamed attention of a neighbor who has been in a house many times and is checking whether things are as they should be. She looked at the blue mug. She looked at the calendar on the wall. She looked at the lock on the back door. Then she looked at Edna. She said she had seen a truck parked out front earlier. Dark one. Stayed too long to be someone turning around. Edna felt the tension across her shoulders shift slightly. Not release. Confirm. She said Ruth had seen it too. Ruth said she knew the difference between a lost driver and a person who was watching something. She said it the way people say things they have had occasion to know firsthand. Not with drama. With the simple flatness of experience. Edna said she agreed. Ruth looked at the shed key on the table. She said Harold had kept that shed locked for as long as she could remember. She said she had never seen the inside of it. She said Harold was a man who respected locked doors and kept the things he wanted to keep behind them. Edna looked at the key. Ruth said there was a man named Sam Briggs who had surveyed this part of Monroe County for 30 years before he half retired. She said he knew the lines of Stone Creek Road better than anyone currently breathing. And she said that if the recorded easement Dolan had mentioned was what she thought it might be, Sam Briggs was the person to call before anyone else. She said she could get his number. Edna said she would appreciate that. Ruth sat at the kitchen table and poured water from the tap, and they did not speak for a while. The shed was visible through the window. The padlock hung at the hasp. The afternoon was going toward evening, and the light was doing what November light does in this part of Tennessee, pulling back early, going gray at the edges before it was gone. Edna picked up the key. Tomorrow, she thought. The shed, tomorrow. But she held the key in her palm and looked at it and understood in the careful way she had come to understand most things that what was inside that shed was not simply old tractor equipment, or stored feed, or the accumulated material of a man's long life. On a piece of ground, someone had tried to get to it before she could. That meant Harold had put something in there that mattered. That meant Harold had known someone might come looking. The letter was in her purse. The key was in her hand. The truck had come and gone, and would probably come again. The road was recorded in county documents, and Patrice had known to mention it without being asked. Edna Marsh sat in Harold's kitchen with the cold key pressed into her palm and looked through the window at the shed in the failing light. She did not know everything yet, but she had learned enough to know that the house Glenn had laughed at and the land Patrice had called a burden were neither one of those things. They were a question Harold had already answered. She just had to read far enough to find it. Monroe County kept its records in a low brick building 2 blocks east of the courthouse square, in a room that smelled of toner and old folders, and the particular institutional stillness of a place where no one raises their voice, because the documents themselves are already saying everything that needs to be said. Edna had driven there in the early morning before the cold fully lifted, with the survey stake wrapped in newspaper on the passenger seat, and Ruth Colby's directions written on the back of an envelope in her lap. She had not slept well. The house made sounds at night that a person had to learn, and she had not learned them yet. Twice she had been certain she heard tires on gravel. Both times she went to the window and found only the dark road and the tilted mailbox and the bare trees standing at the edge of the yard, the way trees stand when they are simply being trees and not harboring anything. She had lain awake after the second time and thought about the letter. Glenn brought a man from a land company to this house 14 months ago. She had turned that sentence over and over in the dark, the way you turn something unfamiliar in your hands, trying to find its edges, trying to understand its weight. 14 months ago, Harold had still been ambulatory, still driving himself to the county co-op for seed and supplies, still managing the property the way he had managed it for 30 years, which was to say, quietly and without asking for assistance, and with a stubbornness that his doctor had described as counterproductive and that Edna had privately considered one of his more reliable qualities. 14 months ago, Glenn had brought a man from a land company into that kitchen, and Harold had said no. And Glenn had kept the man's card. She had arrived at the records office when it opened at 8:30 and stood at the front counter with the wrapped steak and asked for whoever handled parcel records and easement documentation for Stone Creek Road. The woman who came to the counter was named Marcy Cole. She was somewhere in her mid-40s with short, practical hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the expression of a person who has spent enough years in this particular room to have developed a genuine interest in what the documents actually say, rather than what people wish they said. She did not make Edna feel foolish for being there. She did not sigh or look at the clock. She asked for the parcel address and the owner of record, and she typed both into her terminal and read what came back with the patient attention of someone who understood that the information mattered. She began with what was expected. Acreage, legal description, tax history going back to the original survey, transfer records, the deed in Harold's name recorded 28 years ago when he bought out his brother's share of the Stone Creek property and consolidated the parcel into what it was today. Edna listened to each item and held it in place. Then Marcy Cole scrolled and was quiet for a moment. She said there was an easement attached to the parcel. She said it was old. She turned the monitor slightly so Edna could see it from the other side of the counter. which was a small gesture and a significant one, and she explained what she was looking at. The easement had been recorded in 1978, which predated Harold's ownership by several years. It described a road access route originating near the front gate of the Stone Creek property and running across the rear portion of the parcel behind the outbuildings, along the lower slope and terminating at the boundary of the adjacent upper tract. Marcy said she would print the documentation. While the printer warmed, she brought up a second record. A plat map older, scanned from a physical document and slightly washed out in places but legible. She spread it on the counter and oriented it so Edna could follow. Here was Stone Creek Road. Here was the front gate. Here was the house footprint and the outbuildings. And here, this narrow line, this was the recorded access route. Edna traced it with her eyes. The line began at the gate, moved past. The house passed behind what she now knew was the feed shed, continued along the lower slope of the rear acreage, and then continued past the tree line into the adjacent parcel. She asked what was on the other side of the tree line. Marcy pulled up a third record. The parcel behind Harold's land was larger, irregular in shape, mostly wooded according to the land use classification, with some cleared acreage along the northern edge. It had changed ownership 3 years ago. The current owner of record was a registered LLC, Ridgeline Development Partners. Edna stood very still on her side of the counter. She said the name back quietly, not as a question, just to hear it outside her own head. Marcy said that was correct. The printer finished its work. Marcy gathered the pages and straightened them and was about to hand them across the counter when she stopped. She had found something else. She leaned closer to the monitor, and her expression changed in the way expressions change when a person reads something they were not expecting to find. She said there was a secondary attachment on the parcel file. She said she wanted to make sure she was reading it correctly before she described it. Edna waited. Marcy read for a moment. Then she said that there was a notice of intent to purchase on file. She said it had been submitted to the county recorder's office and attached to the parcel record as a preliminary claim document. She said this was not a lien and not a deed and not a binding instrument, but it was a document that signaled a party's intent to enter into a purchase agreement on a specific parcel. Edna asked when it had been filed. Marcy looked at the screen. She said it had been filed 10 months ago. 10 months ago, Harold Marsh had been in Baptist Memorial Hospital in Knoxville for the second of what would become 3 admissions over the following 5 months. 10 months ago, he had been thin and diminished, and sleeping more hours than he was awake, and Edna had driven twice a week to sit with him and keep the nurse's station informed of his medication preferences and bring him the particular kind of crackers he could still eat without discomfort. 10 months ago, Glenn Marsh had filed a notice of intent to purchase Harold Marsh's land. Edna put both hands flat on the counter. She asked whose name was on the filing. Marcy said the filing had been submitted by an attorney of record. She read the name. Edna did not recognize it, but she wrote it down. She wrote it carefully in the small notebook she had taken from her purse, the same notebook where she had written, "Patrice mentioned the road before I did, and dark truck watching the gate." She wrote the attorney's name, and she wrote 10 months ago next to it. And she wrote Harold in hospital. And then she stopped writing and looked at what she had written. Marcy said quietly that she could not interpret legal documents or advise on their implications. She said that was not her role. But she said that attachments like this one had a way of mattering more than people expected, and that it would be worth having someone with appropriate expertise review everything before Edna made any decisions about the property. Edna said she did not plan to make any decisions today. Marcy said that was wise. She handed the printed pages across the counter. Edna took them, folded them once, and placed them in her purse next to the envelope with Harold's letter. She thanked Marcy Cole and meant it. Outside, the morning had turned colder. She crossed the sidewalk toward her car, with the November air sharp against her face, and her thoughts arranged in a careful line, each one following the last. The notice of intent. The attorney's name she did not recognize but would verify. The access easement running from her gate to Ridgeline's property. Glenn's name not on the filing, but Glenn's hand almost certainly behind it. The way a man puts his hand behind a door without quite touching it. So he can later say he never pushed. She was 3 steps from her car when she saw the truck. It was parked across the street from the records office, pulled to the far curb in front of a hardware store that appeared to be closed on Tuesdays. Dark colored. She could not see the plate from this angle, but she did not need to. The dent near the rear bumper was the same dent she had seen the previous afternoon. The tinted windshield gave back the overcast sky without revealing whoever sat behind it. The brake lights came on, just the brake lights. The engine did not start immediately. Whoever was inside was looking at her, letting her know they were looking at her or not caring whether she knew which in some ways was worse. Then the engine turned over and the truck pulled into the street and moved past the courthouse at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, just deliberate, the pace of something that has decided to leave, but is not afraid of being seen leaving. Edna stood on the sidewalk and watched it go. She got in her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Someone had followed her here or had anticipated she would come here, which required either surveillance or a familiarity with how a woman in her position would think. And both possibilities told her the same thing. This was not a family disagreement about sentiment and inheritance. This had been in motion for longer than the funeral, longer than Harold's last months, longer than she had known there was anything to be in motion about. She started the car and drove back to Stone Creek Road. The feed shed key was on the kitchen table where she had left it. She had looked at it through the window when she came in, made herself a cup of coffee. She did not entirely want. Sat at the table for 10 minutes, thinking about the order of things, and then she put on her coat and went out. The morning was still and gray. No wind in the tree line. No sound from the road. The yard was empty and the gate was closed and the mailbox stood at its familiar tilt against the bare sky. She walked to the shed. The padlock hung at the hasp. The scratches around the keyhole were as she had left them, bright against the old metal not yet darkened. The boot print in the mud had dried overnight and hardened into a clearer impression than it had been the day before, the tread pattern more distinct. The heel deeper than the toe, the print of a man who carried his weight back. She put the key in the lock. It turned hard, the mechanism stiff from years of disuse, and for a moment she thought it would not give. She held steady and applied even pressure the way Harold had always said to do with old locks, not force. Just patience. Just the consistent application of the right amount of effort in the right direction. The lock opened. She lifted it away from the hasp and pulled the shed door. The smell that came out was of oil and old wood and something mineral underneath. Both the smell of a space that had been closed for a long time and had settled into itself, accumulating the particular atmosphere of undisturbed things. Thin light came through the gaps between the wall planks, drawing pale stripes across the dirt floor, across the rusted hoe, leaning against the near wall. Across the broken fencing rolled in a coil in the corner, across the stack of clay pots near the door, across 2 tires propped against the south wall. Then her eyes adjusted. In the back corner, half covered by a canvas tarp and positioned behind the clay pots, at an angle that would have put it out of the immediate sight line of anyone who opened the door and looked straight ahead rather than slightly left, was a metal cabinet. Industrial, waist-high. Painted dark green, the paint worn to gray at the corners. Old but solid, the kind of equipment manufactured when things were built to last rather than built to be replaced. She crossed the shed floor and pulled the tarp aside. The cabinet had a lock, a different kind than the padlock at the door, a built-in mechanism with a keyhole plate. And around the keyhole plate, the same bright scratches she had found on the exterior lock. The same fresh marks, the same light metal showing beneath the surface, the same evidence of someone working at a lock they did not have the key to. They had not gotten through this one either. She looked at the cabinet. She looked at the shelves on either side of it. She checked the coffee can full of hardware near the door. She moved the clay pots. She looked along the window ledge. Then she remembered what Harold had written. Not what he had written in the letter, but the way he had written it. Practically, without ornamentation. The man who taped important things under ketchup bottles because that was where he put small items he needed to find and not have everyone else find. The man who kept his truck registration behind the sun visor rather than in the glove box, because the glove box was the first place anyone looked. She crouched down. She ran her hand under the bottom shelf of the nearest set of metal shelving, palm up, fingers extended. Her hand found a strip of tape. She peeled it back. A small brass key came loose, stuck to the underside of the shelf, with a piece of electrical tape that had gone brittle at the edges but held. She stood up with the key in her hand and looked at it. It was smaller than the shed key, similar in age. She unlocked the cabinet. Inside were 6 file folders hanging in a row from a wire bracket near the top. Each one was labeled in Harold's handwriting, the same practical, unornamented script she had been reading for 22 years. Road, timber, spring, taxes, survey. And at the back, slightly thicker than the others, a folder with her full name on the tab. Edna Louise Marsh. She stood in front of the open cabinet and looked at the folders for a moment. Then she carried the one labeled Road to the small workbench near the door, where the light was better, and opened it. Inside was a copy of the same easement documentation Marcy Cole had printed for her that morning. The same plat map, the same legal description of the access route running from the front gate to the rear boundary. Harold had obtained his own copy she could see from the date stamp 3 years ago, shortly after Ridgeline Development Partners acquired the parcel behind his land. He had been watching this for 3 years. He had known what the access meant before anyone came to his door. She opened the spring folder next. Inside was a handwritten description of the water source in the lower pasture. Harold's own account of it with measurements of flow rate at different seasons. A note about the quality of the water. A reference to a state agricultural extension report he had requested through the county office. He had attached a letter from a land management consultant he had contacted 18 months ago, before he became too ill to manage his own correspondence reliably. The consultant's letter was 4 paragraphs. The last paragraph said that a reliable natural water source of this type in proximity to a recorded access route with direct connection to undeveloped upper acreage would significantly increase the development value of any project requiring that access. It said that the presence of such a source, if properly documented and legally protected, could also constitute a substantial barrier to certain types of development if the property owner chose to pursue conservation options. Harold had underlined that last sentence. He had underlined it in the same blue pen he used for everything, the pen that always lived in his shirt pocket, the one she had found on the nightstand at the hospital and given to the nurse to keep safe. She folded the papers and returned them to the folder. She was reaching for the folder with her name on it when she heard Sam Briggs's truck turn into the drive. Sam Briggs was the kind of man who read the ground the way other people read a room. He walked onto a piece of land and his eyes went down before they went out, checking what was underfoot, before he looked at what was ahead, understanding that the surface usually had more to say than the horizon. He was lean-weathered in the way that people who work outdoors in Tennessee weather for 30 years are weathered, with a canvas cap pulled low and a slight hitch in his left leg that he had never offered to explain and that Edna had not asked about. He carried a measuring wheel in one hand and a clipboard in the other, and he had brought his own coffee in a dented thermos that he set on the hood of his truck before coming to shake her hand. Ruth had described him accurately. He was not a man who skimmed. Edna gave him the easement documentation and the plat map she had gotten from the county records office. He read both without rushing, standing at the hood of his truck with his thermos pushed to one side. He turned the plat map over and checked the notation on the reverse. He read the legal description of the easement twice. Then he looked toward the back of the property. He said, "Let's walk it." They started at the front gate the way Sam always started at the beginning of a thing rather than the middle. He did not begin with the house. He checked the gate posts, the depth of the ditch along the road margin, the line of older fencing that ran east from the gate toward the tree line. He noted things on his clipboard that Edna could not read from where she stood behind him. They moved along the east side of the yard. Sam's eyes moved between the ground and the plat map he carried and the ground again. He pointed out things she would not have noticed. A place where the grass grew differently over what had once been a gravel bed. A line of stones set back just far enough from the fence to have been placed by a person rather than arranged by weather. A change in the grade of the yard, subtle, barely perceptible to someone not looking for it, that ran from near the feed shed and turned toward the rear of the property. Near the shed, Sam stopped. He pressed the toe of his boot into the grass at the edge of the yard and scraped away a thin layer of surface soil. Beneath it, pale and compacted, was gravel. Old gravel, gray with age and pressed flat by years of weight and weather, but gravel, not scattered, laid. The kind of surface that was put there deliberately and has been there long enough to forget what it was for. Edna said so it was real. Sam said it had never stopped being real. He put a small orange flag in the ground and they moved on. Past the shed, the land sloped gently downward, a long, easy grade that would have been comfortable for a vehicle if it had been maintained, if the brush had been kept back, if the grass had not been allowed to grow over what was beneath it. Sam moved along the slope with the unhurried certainty of someone following a line he could feel as much as see. He placed flags as he walked, one, then another, each one marking a point in the hidden route, each one making the next one easier to find. The line of orange flags extended behind them like a sentence being written. Edna followed and watched and said nothing. She had learned at some point in her life she could not precisely locate that the best thing to do when a knowledgeable person is showing you something is to let them show it without interruption. The brush thickened as they descended. Blackberry canes caught at the hem of her coat. Dead grass hid the old ruts, and Edna felt them through her shoes, rather than saw them the shallow channels left by wheels that had passed this way enough times to leave their impression in the soil, and then been left alone for long enough that the impression had been covered over, but not erased. Then the trees opened slightly, and the air changed, cooler, damper, a smell that was distinct from the cold smell of the open yard above. Sam stopped. Edna stopped beside him and listened. Water. Beneath the sound of the wind in the upper branches, beneath the dry rustle of the dead grass around them, there was the sound of water moving over stone. Steady and unhurried, the sound that water makes when it has been making that same sound for longer than anyone currently living can remember. They stepped through a gap in the brush. The spring came out from under a shelf of limestone at the base of the slope. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just emerging from the rock, the way springs do, as though the water had been there all along, and the rock had simply decided to step aside at this particular point. The flow was not large. It filled a channel perhaps 8 inches wide and ran over dark, flat stones and curved through a shallow bed of fern and dark soil before disappearing into the lower pasture, bending around tree roots, carrying its cold clarity into the trees below. The ground around it was green even in November. Sam took off his cap. He stood and looked at the spring for a moment with an expression that was not sentiment exactly, but something close to the respect a person shows for things that are older and more patient than they are. He said not to let anyone tear through this. Edna asked why. He said, because a spring like this, once damaged, was the kind of thing people spent years pretending they could restore. He said the word restore was used by people who had not worked enough land to know that some things did not restore, they only diminished more slowly. He said the road, the timber rights, and the water source were all within close proximity of one another, and that this combination made the land useful in ways that a person could spend a long time not realizing. He said useful land attracted careless people. She looked at the spring and thought about Harold's underlined sentence, a substantial barrier to certain types of development if the property owner chose to pursue conservation options. Then Sam went quiet. He was looking at something above and to the left of where they were standing up the slope near the tree line, where the larger trees began. Edna followed his gaze. A walnut tree stood at the edge of the access route, old and straight, the bark dark and deeply furrowed. Around its trunk at chest height, someone had tied a strip of tape. Blue tape. Bright and clean and new, the kind used for marking and survey work, still vivid against the gray bark. Not faded, not weathered, not there for more than a few days at most. Sam walked to it. He touched the edge of the tape with 2 fingers. He looked at it closely, then looked up the slope toward the ridge, then looked back down toward the spring. His face did not change dramatically, but something in it hardened. He asked whether she had put it there. She said no. He said then someone else had been walking her timber. He took out his phone and photographed the tape, the tree, the surrounding ground. He told her not to touch it yet. He said he wanted documentation in place before it was removed. He said he was going to look at the surrounding trees. he found two more marked trees within 30 feet of the first. Both blue tape, both fresh, both at chest height on significant timber. Edna stood among the walnut trees and understood what she was looking at. Someone had been assessing her timber, not casually, with the deliberate, systematic attention of a person preparing documentation for a development proposal or a resource extraction estimate. Someone who knew what they were looking for and had walked this ground with a purpose and had left these marks as working notes for a project they had not yet announced and expected to be completed before the woman who owned the land had time to understand what she owned. Sam said he was going to need to do a full boundary walk. He said he had something to look at first, and he moved east along the tree line, his eyes on the ground, his clipboard in his hand. Edna stayed near the marked walnut and looked at the blue tape. It was such an ordinary piece of material, plastic and adhesive, and a color chosen for visibility, the kind of thing available at any hardware store. And it had been tied around a tree on her land that had Harold's name in the deed, and now had hers by someone who had walked here without her permission and without her knowledge, and had done so with enough confidence to leave evidence of their presence behind. That confidence told her something. It told her that whoever had been here had not expected to need to explain themselves, had not expected to be confronted with a property owner who would notice or object, had expected, in other words, that by the time anyone looked closely at this land, the question of who it belonged to would already be settled in a different direction. She heard Sam stop. She turned. He was crouched near the east boundary line about 40 feet from where she stood, his clipboard on the ground beside him, and his hands working at something in the soil. She walked to him. He had scraped away the surface soil around a metal survey pin, the kind of permanent boundary marker that gets set in concrete when a parcel is officially surveyed and recorded. He had his measuring tape out, and he was checking the position of the pin against the coordinates in his documentation. He did not speak for a moment. She waited. He said, "This pin has been moved." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who has looked at enough survey pins to know the difference between one that has settled naturally over decades and one that has been disturbed. He said the concrete anchor was intact, but the pin itself showed signs of having been extracted and reset the soil around it, disturbed and repacked the alignment off by enough to matter on paper. He said the pin's current position placed the east boundary of the Stone Creek parcel approximately 40 feet south of where the recorded survey said it should be. 40 feet. Across the full length of the rear boundary line. A narrow strip of land not wide but long running the length of the property's eastern edge, closest to where the access route connected with Ridgeline's parcel. He said this isn't a mistake. Someone moved this pin. She stood and looked at the small metal marker in the ground and thought about everything she now knew in the order she had learned it. Glenn bringing a man from Ridgeline to Harold's kitchen 14 months ago. The notice of intent filed by Glenn's attorney while Harold was hospitalized. The scratches on the feed shed lock. The boot print in the mud. The truck outside the records office. The blue tape on her walnut trees. And now a survey pin moved 40 feet south of its recorded position, shrinking her land quietly at the boundary closest to the parcel Ridgeline had spent 3 years wanting to access. Each piece by itself could have been explained. Together they described something that did not require explanation. It explained itself. Sam was still crouching by the pin photographing it, noting the coordinates. He said he was going to need the original survey documentation to formalize his findings. He said she should not mention any of this to anyone until she had spoken with her attorney. She said she would call Frank Dolan that afternoon. He looked up at her from his crouched position with the expression of a man who wants to say something direct and is deciding how direct to be. He said, "Somebody has been treating this land as though the question of ownership was already answered." She said she understood. He said, "Make sure everyone else understands it isn't." Glenn arrived without calling first. She had been back in the kitchen for less than an hour. Sam had gone. She had made tea. She was not drinking, and she was sitting at the table with the folder labeled Road open in front of her when she heard the truck in the drive. She recognized the sound of it. She moved the folders into the bread drawer beneath the counter, not hiding them, putting them where they did not need to be explained to someone she had not invited. She went to the front door. Glenn was in the yard when she opened it. He had parked close to the fence, and he was standing with his back to the house, looking toward the rear of the property, toward the tree line, toward the slope where Sam's orange flags were still visible in the dormant grass. Not looking at the house, not looking at her car, looking at the land. She stood in the doorway and waited. He turned when he heard the door. His expression arrived slightly behind the turn, the smile assembling itself in the half-second between his body reacting and his face composing itself into what he intended to present. He said he had been in the area. Crow Ridge Road was not a road people were in the area of. Stone Creek Road was not on the way to anything except more of Stone Creek Road, and then the ridge and then the county line. Glenn Marsh was not a man who drove 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning because he happened to be passing through. She said she had not known he was coming. He climbed the porch steps without being asked. The boards gave under him in the way they had always given, accommodating but not welcoming. He looked at the door frame, at the siding, at the patched section of roof visible from the porch, and his expression suggested a man walking through an argument he had already won. He said he wanted to make sure she was all right. He said Patrice had told him she had seemed tense on the phone, and he had not wanted her out here alone without someone checking. She said she was not alone. She said Ruth Colby came by regularly. He made a small sound that categorized Ruth Colby as a detail not worth discussing. He said all these papers and documents and old maps could be confusing if you weren't used to reading that kind of thing. He said he knew the county knew the people at the assessor's office knew who to call about access agreements and easements, and what they did and did not obligate a landowner to do. He said he was happy to help her sort through it. She asked what kind of help he had in mind. He said he could start by looking at the road access documentation. He said old easements like the one on this parcel could be complicated and sometimes did not mean what they appeared to mean, and sometimes meant more than people expected. And either way, it required someone with experience to read them correctly. She said she had already had the documents reviewed. He paused. He said by whom? She said by the appropriate people. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her into the house toward the kitchen at the table with nothing on it, because she had put the folders away. His eyes moved from the table to the bread drawer and back to her face. He said she needed to be careful about who she listened to out here. He said a woman living alone on a piece of property like this was a target for people who would see an opportunity and dress it up as advice. He said surveyors and consultants charged by the hour and the meter started running the moment you called them. and by the time they were finished telling her what she wanted to hear, she would have spent money she did not have on information she could have gotten for free from family. She said she appreciated his concern. He said she should consider Patrice's offer more seriously. He said $25,000 was real money. Money she could do something with, money that would not require her to understand easements or timber rights or old survey documentation or any of the complications that came with land like this. He said, "This place isn't what you think it is, Edna." She said, "What do I think it is?" He looked at her. He said she thought it was an inheritance. He said it was actually a set of obligations attached to a structure that needed work and land that looked significant on paper and added up to less than it appeared once you understood what it actually cost to manage. He was saying all of this with the measured confidence of a man who had said it or some version of it many times and found it effective. The weight of the delivery, the patience of the repetition, the implication that he was doing her a favor by being clear rather than kind. She looked at him and said nothing. He shifted slightly. He looked toward the side yard, toward the feed shed, toward the slope beyond it. He said she had been talking to people. He said that was evident. He said she should be careful, because people who came around a property situation like this with helpful information often had interests of their own. She said she would keep that in mind. He moved toward the porch steps. He had said what he came to say, and she had not responded to it the way he expected. And now he was recalibrating. She could see it. The slight adjustment in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes went back to the land behind the house. He stopped at the top of the steps. He said you should know that the road doesn't mean what people will tell you it means. Old access easements get challenged and revised, and sometimes they don't hold up when you actually press them. The timber markings can be misread. Springs dry up. A lot of what sounds valuable turns out to be expensive to maintain and impossible to monetize. He had named all three things: the road, the timber, the spring. She had not told him about the spring. She had not told him about the timber assessment. She had not told him that Sam Briggs had walked the property that morning, or that they had found marked trees, or that Sam had found anything at all. She said, "Did you walk my land, Glenn?" He blinked. Just once. The single involuntary acknowledgement of a question that arrived somewhere it was not supposed to. He said he did not know what she meant. She said she meant exactly what she had asked. He looked at the porch steps, and then at the side yard, and then he began to move down the steps. She watched him go. He was wearing work boots. Heavy ones, good ones. The boots of a man who spent time on uneven ground. He took the steps one at a time and turned toward his truck. And as he turned, the angle of the afternoon light caught the sole of his right boot. She saw it clearly. A smear of bright blue on the outer edge of the heel. The particular bright blue of fresh marking tape. The same blue she had seen tied around the trunk of her walnut tree not 3 hours ago. She did not speak. He reached his truck and opened the door, and she was still standing in the doorway, and neither of them said anything. And in that silence, the only sound was the door of his truck and the crunch of gravel under his feet. And then he was in the cab, and the engine was starting. He had seen her looking at his boot. He had not looked down at it. He had seen her eyes go there, and he had known in the instant of recognizing what she was looking at that she had already understood what it meant. He drove out of the gate and turned north on Stone Creek Road. She stood in the doorway until the sound of his truck was gone. Then she went to the kitchen table and sat down and opened her notebook. Blue marking tape residue on heel of Glenn's right boot. Same shade as tape on walnut trees. He named the road, the timber, and the spring without being told. She put the pen down and sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the window and the yard and the shed and the slope beyond it. The phone rang at 7:20 that evening. She did not recognize the number, but she recognized the area code as local, and she answered. The voice on the other end was male and young and low, the deliberate low of someone who did not want to be overheard. He said, "Aunt Edna." "It's Colt." She said she knew. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing. She could hear the sound of a car's ventilation system somewhere behind his voice, which meant he was calling from a vehicle, which meant he had driven somewhere away from home before making this call. He said, "I need to tell you something. I don't know if it's the right thing to do, but I keep thinking about it and I think you need to know." She said, "Go ahead." He said, 6 months ago, my father signed a preliminary agreement with Ridgeline Development, a letter of intent. He told them the property at Stone Creek would be available. He told them the transfer was going to be straightforward. She waited. He said he didn't know Uncle Harold had changed the will. He thought the land was going to come to the family collectively, and that he could move it from there. When Dolan read the will and your name was on it, my father had already signed that letter. She said, "How long have you known this?" He said he had known for about 3 months. He said he had found the document in his father's desk. He said he had not known what to do with it. She said, "Is there anything else?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "There's a man named Whitfield. He's the one who moved the survey pin." She did not react to this out loud. She sat with the information and placed it next to everything else she had placed in the last 2 days. The way you place pieces of a thing that was broken and are only now seeing how it was supposed to fit. She thanked Colt Marsh. She said she was glad he had called. He said he was sorry. He said it quietly and without elaboration, and she thought he meant it. After she ended the call, she sat for a long time at Harold's kitchen table in the house that was hers. Now the house Glenn had laughed at, and Patrice had called a burden the house where she had washed dishes and sat through Wednesday afternoons and brought crackers Harold could eat and kept the nurse's station informed of medication preferences. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Colt called from a number I don't know. Letter of intent 6 months ago. Ridgeline." Pin moved by Whitfield. Then she closed the notebook and put her hands flat on the table and looked at the folder with her name on it, still sitting on the counter where she had left it when she heard Sam's truck in the drive. She had not yet opened it. She had been saving it without quite letting herself know that was what she was doing. She had read road and spring and looked at survey documentation, and she had kept the folder with her own name on it for last, because she understood in the quiet way she understood most important things, that whatever Harold had put in that folder was what the rest of it had been pointing toward. She reached for it. Outside, the wind had come up. The trees along the ridge moved against the dark sky, their bare branches drawing patterns against the stars. The spring was down in the lower pasture, doing what it had always done, cold and steady and patient, moving over the same stones it had moved over, long before anyone had drawn lines around the land it crossed. The orange flags Sam had planted along the old roadbed stood in the dark grass, small and bright, marking a path that had always been there, that had been covered over and ignored and allowed to disappear beneath 20 years of growth and assumption. They were still visible through the kitchen window. Edna opened the folder. The folder had 6 pages. Edna read them at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and her coat still across the back of her chair, and the last of her tea gone cold beside her. She read each page carefully, the way she had learned to read things that mattered, not skimming, not rushing toward the conclusion. Before she had understood the reasoning that led to it, she set each page face down when she finished it and moved to the next. The first 2 pages were Harold's accounting of the land, not a legal document, not a professional assessment. Harold's own record, handwritten in the same blue pen of what the Stone Creek property actually was, what it contained, what it was worth in the ways that required knowledge rather than assumption. He had written descriptions of the timber on the upper acreage species. By species with age estimates he had arrived at by studying the county extension office's forestry guides. He had written about the spring with the same precision he had applied to everything else. Flow rate mineral content from the extension office water analysis he had requested. Seasonal variation he had observed across 30 years of walking that lower pasture. He had written about the road. He had written about it in terms that were practical and clear, the way a man writes who understands something completely and wants to make sure the understanding survives him. The access easement, he wrote, was not incidental. It was the reason Ridgeline had purchased the upper tract. The northern and eastern approaches to that parcel were too steep and too wet for economical road construction. The western boundary abutted a conservation easement held by the county TT, a land trust that predated Ridgeline's ownership by 20 years and would not be disturbed without litigation that would cost more than the land was worth in any practical sense. The southern approach was Stone Creek, his land. The access route running from his front gate to the boundary of Ridgeline's upper tract was not one of several ways in. It was the only way in that made economic sense. He had written this, and then he had written they have known this since before they bought the upper parcel. They bought the upper parcel because they expected to acquire this one. Edna sat with that for a moment. Then she turned to the 3rd page. It was a letter from the same land management consultant she had found referenced in the spring folder, dated 16 months ago, written in response to Harold's inquiry about the legal implications of the recorded easement. The consultant had been thorough. He described the access right, the obligations it created, the ways it could be exercised, the ways it could theoretically be extinguished, and the conditions under which a property owner could decline to facilitate access while maintaining legal ownership of the easement corridor itself. He had written in his 3rd paragraph that a property owner in Harold's position was not obligated to make access convenient, that maintaining the road surface to a passable standard was a matter of negotiation rather than automatic obligation, that the value of the easement to the adjacent parcel's owner was significant enough that a motivated negotiation pursued by a property owner with adequate legal counsel could result in terms that substantially benefited the Stone Creek parcel. Harold had underlined the phrase adequate legal counsel. He had also written in his own hand in the margin called Dolan, The fourth page was a copy of a document she had not expected. She read the heading twice. Declaration of Protective Conservation Easement, Monroe County, Tennessee. Recorded at the County Register of Deeds. Date of recording 8 months ago. 8 months ago, Harold Marsh had been in the hospital for the second time. He had been thin and sleeping more than he was awake, and the doctors had been using language that was careful, in the way that language is careful when it is trying to be honest, without being abrupt. 8 months ago, Edna had driven to Knoxville twice a week and sat with him through the afternoons and driven home in the dark. 8 months ago, he had also found the energy to contact Frank Dolan and instruct him to prepare and record a protective conservation easement on the Stone Creek parcel. She read the document. It covered the spring and the lower pasture surrounding it within a specified radius. It covered the access corridor running from the front gate to the rear boundary the entire length of the old road. It covered the timber on the upper acreage, establishing that no commercial harvesting could occur without the written consent of the landowner and a review conducted by a qualified forester. And it covered a strip of land along the eastern boundary, narrow, running the full length of the property's eastern edge. The document stated clearly that none of the protected areas could be transferred, encumbered, developed, or accessed for commercial purposes without the written consent of the legal owner of record of the Stone Creek parcel and without a review period of not less than 90 days following formal written notice. Glenn Marsh had signed a letter of intent with Ridgeline Development 6 months ago, 2 months after Harold had recorded this document. Glenn had signed a letter promising that the Stone Creek land would be available. He had made that promise to a company that needed the access corridor and the spring and the eastern boundary strip, all three of which Harold had already placed under legal protection that Glenn did not know existed. Glenn had spent 6 months believing he was managing a transaction that Harold had already made impossible. Edna sat very still in the kitchen with the document in her hands. She thought about Harold in that hospital bed, thin and diminished and working at something in the intervals between sleep and medication, and the particular exhaustion of a body managing its own decline. She thought about what it had cost him to make those phone calls, to review those documents, to sign his name with the clarity required for legal instruments when his hands were not as steady as they had once been. He had known Glenn was coming. He had not been able to wait to warn her in person. So he had done the next best thing. He had locked the door himself before he left. The 5th page was a short note. 3 sentences in Harold's handwriting addressed to Frank Dolan. It said, "Edna will find this. Make sure the recording is confirmed and accessible. She will know what to do with it." The 6th page was blank. Edna set the folder on the table. She sat without moving for a long time. The refrigerator made its low working sound. The wind had come up outside, and she could hear it in the eaves of the house. The old house, the house with the patched roof and the dipping porch, and the chipped blue mug beside the sink. The house Glenn had laughed at. She was still sitting there when her phone lit up with a message from Frank Dolan, responding to the call she had placed before dinner. He confirmed what the document said. He said the recording was clean and binding. He said she should not speak with anyone representing Ridgeline Development without him present. He said she should call him in the morning before she did anything else. She texted back, "They're coming tomorrow." He responded within a minute, "I'll be there." They came at 10:30. Edna heard them before she saw them. She was on the porch with a cup of coffee when the sound of tires on gravel came from the direction of Stone Creek Road. More than one vehicle, the overlapping sounds of engines slowing at the gate. She did not go inside. She stood on the porch and watched. The first vehicle through the gate was a silver SUV moving carefully over the gravel, parking to the left of the drive near the fence. Patrice got out of the passenger side with her coat buttoned and her composure arranged, and her expression set to something between concern and authority. A man Edna did not know got out of the driver's side, younger than Patrice, the kind of polish that goes with professional attire and deliberate grooming. The second vehicle was Glenn's truck. He parked behind the SUV and sat in the cab for a moment before getting out the way. A person sits who is preparing themselves rather than simply stopping. The third vehicle was a white pickup with a magnetic sign on the door. Ridgeline Development Partners. The man who got out was mid-50s, clean boots, rolled documents under one arm, and the expression of someone who had arrived expecting a meeting that had been arranged and was now reading the porch and the woman standing on it and beginning to suspect that the arrangement was not quite what he had been told. His name was Craig Donner. She knew this from Colt's call the previous evening, from the research she had done after reading Harold's folder, from the notes Sam Briggs had shared about Ridgeline's public filings. Craig Donner was a project development coordinator. He had been with Ridgeline for 9 years. He had managed 3 land acquisition projects in the eastern Tennessee region. None of those projects had involved a property owner who already had a conservation easement recorded in the county register. She watched him look at the property the way a professional looks at a property, taking in the structure, the outbuildings, the slope of the land behind the house, the tree line. He was not looking at the house the way Glenn looked at it, as something too small to be serious. He was looking at it the way a person looks at something that contains a question they need answered. Ruth Colby came around the corner of the house from the backyard with garden gloves in her hand, and the direct expression of a woman who had been on this road for 41 years and was not impressed by the number of vehicles or the quality of the coats. Sam Briggs's truck turned into the drive and parked near the gate. Frank Dolan's car arrived 2 minutes later. Glenn watched Dolan get out of his car with an expression that moved through several states in a short time. Surprise, calculation, and then the particular composure of a man deciding how to continue with a plan that has encountered an obstacle he did not anticipate but does not intend to acknowledge. Glenn came forward. He said this was a family conversation, and there was no need for everyone to make it formal. Frank Dolan said, "Good morning to Glenn, to Patrice, to Craig Donner, to each of them by name, with the unhurried courtesy of a man who has conducted more difficult meetings than this one, and is not afraid of any of them." Then he turned to Edna and nodded once. She came down the porch steps. She said if everyone came to talk about the road, then we should all walk it. They went in the order she set. Sam led from the front because he knew the ground. Edna walked behind him. Frank Dolan came to her left. Ruth stayed 3 paces back and watched everyone with the patient attention of a woman who had learned that the back of a group sees more than the front. Craig Donner followed his rolled documents under his arm. Glenn came after him, and Patrice after Glenn, and the younger man from the SUV brought up the rear, apparently having been introduced to no one and not quite understanding yet whether he was a participant or a witness. Glenn made conversation as they walked. He narrated the property the way a guide narrates a tour, pointing out conditions, mentioning maintenance costs, noting the state of the fencing and the grade of the slope. all of it framed as evidence that the land was more complicated than it appeared, and more of a burden than a benefit. He was performing for Craig Donner. He was doing it with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing this particular role for some time. Craig Donner was not listening to Glenn. He was watching Sam Briggs. Sam did not narrate. He moved along the old access corridor with his clipboard and his measuring wheel, and he let the ground speak for itself. He pointed out the exposed gravel at the edge of the shed. He followed the line of the old roadbed down the slope, the orange flags he had placed the previous morning still standing in the dormant grass, each one a mark on a sentence the land was writing for itself. Craig crouched at one point to look at the gravel more closely. He pressed a hand into the grass beside it and felt the firmness of the old compacted base beneath. He unrolled one of his documents and compared a line on it to the line of flags on the slope. He said quietly to no one in particular that the corridor was longer than his documentation indicated. Glenn said the old easement was more limited in scope than it appeared on paper, and that the legal interpretation was something they could discuss. Craig looked at him. He said he preferred to look at what was actually there before discussing interpretation. He rolled his document and tucked it back under his arm and kept walking. They went down the slope. The brush thinned near the bottom, and the air changed the way it had changed when Edna walked here, with Sam cooler and damper, and carrying that particular mineral smell. The sound of the water reached them before they saw it. Craig Donner stopped. He stood at the edge of the spring basin and looked at the water moving over the flat stones and the green around it and the dark soil and the tree roots at the margins, and his expression settled into something that was not surprise exactly, but was the particular attention of a man who has found a variable in a calculation that changes the outcome significantly. He said he had not been told there was an active water source here. Glenn said it was a small seasonal branch that dried up in summer. Sam said it was not seasonal, and it didn't dry up, and he had the flow measurements from the previous morning and the extension office records going back 11 years to confirm that. Glenn looked at Sam. Sam looked at his clipboard. Ruth said something under her breath that Edna did not fully hear, but the two words she did catch were exactly right. Patrice moved forward. She positioned herself beside Craig with the practice movement of a woman who understands how proximity functions in a conversation. She said they were not here to argue about the physical features of the property. She said they were here because the family wanted to make sure Edna understood her options fully before she made any decisions, and that Ridgeline's interest was simply in having a preliminary conversation about access. Frank Dolan said access on what terms and under whose authority. Patrice said that was what they were here to discuss. Dolan said that was indeed what they were here to discuss, and that it would be productive to begin by establishing what Ridgeline understood their access arrangement to be, and with whom they believed that arrangement had been made. Craig Donner looked at Glenn. The look was brief and professional, and it said without any words at all that Craig Donner was now operating with a different understanding of this meeting than the one he had arrived with, and that he was revising his position accordingly. Glenn said, "We don't need to get into that out here." Edna said, "Yes, we do." The words landed quietly. Glenn turned to look at her with the expression of a man who has been managing a situation and has just discovered that the situation has been managing him. She held his gaze and waited. They followed Sam up the slope toward the eastern tree line. He had not replaced the blue marking tape on the walnut trees. He had documented it and removed it, and the trees stood unmarked. Now the bark clean and dark in the November light. He pointed to the first of them and described what had been there. He described the systematic nature of the marking, the consistency of the height and placement, the coverage pattern across the timber stand. Craig said he had not authorized any timber assessment on this parcel. Glenn said the marking could have been done by anyone. Ruth said that was the second time this week someone had suggested that things on this property had happened by themselves. No one answered her. Sam continued east along the tree line, and Edna stayed close behind him. Glenn had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he was calculating rather than performing. And she tracked that silence, the way she tracked his silences, the way she had learned over 22 years to track the things he said, without words. Near the eastern boundary, Sam stopped. He crouched beside a point in the ground that looked unremarkable to anyone who did not know what to look for. He had marked it with a small flag the previous morning, different from the orange flags on the road, a white flag, and he cleared the grass around it now with his hand to expose the survey pin and the ground around it. He explained what he had found, not with drama, with the flat, descriptive language of a professional who understands that what he is saying does not require dramatizing. He said the pin had been moved. He said the original recorded position placed the eastern boundary approximately 40 feet north of its current location. He said the disturbance to the surrounding soil was consistent with deliberate extraction and reseeding rather than natural settling or frost heave. He said he had photographs documenting the current position and the evidence of disturbance. He said he had also obtained the original survey documentation from the county records archive and had compared the coordinates against the current position. He said the discrepancy was not ambiguous. Craig Donner had stopped taking notes. He was looking at the pin in the ground with the expression of a man who is adding numbers he does not want to add. Glenn said survey pins shifted over time, and that this did not necessarily indicate anything deliberate. Sam said he had been surveying Monroe County land for 30 years, and he knew the difference. Frank Dolan said that the documentation supporting Sam's findings would be filed with the county recorder's office and would be available to all parties. Patrice said this was getting unnecessarily adversarial. Edna said she had not made it adversarial. The words were quiet. They were not unkind. They were simply true in the way that true things sometimes are direct, without requiring justification. Patrice's face changed. Not dramatically. A small tightening around the mouth, a slight shift in the set of her shoulders. The adjustment of a woman whose composure is real but not inexhaustible. Glenn looked toward the house. She had been watching him look at things throughout the walk. The way his attention moved from the road to the spring to the timber to the boundary pin, following the inventory of what he had expected to control, and was finding instead, in the process of being documented and protected and understood by a woman he had spent 22 years treating as someone who did not fully understand what she was standing in the middle of. She watched him and said nothing. Then Colt, who had been standing at the edge of the group since the walk began, not at his father's side, not precisely at Edna's, but in the uncertain middle ground of a person who has made a decision and is not yet sure of its full weight, cleared his throat. He said, "Dad, did you know the easement had already been recorded?" Glenn turned to his son. Colt said it quietly, without accusation. The way a young man says something he has been carrying too long and has finally decided to set down somewhere. It can be seen. Glenn said, "Get in the truck." Colt did not move. He stood in the November grass with his father's eyes on him, and he did not move. And in that stillness, in that single small act of not complying something, shifted in the field that could not be shifted back. Sam was the first to speak after that. He said there was one more thing he wanted to show them. He moved back toward the feed shed along the eastern edge of the yard, and Edna followed, and the rest of the group came behind her, in the disorganized way that groups move when the structure they arrive with has come apart. The shed door was still open from that morning. Sam went to the near side of it and crouched beside the corrugated tin panel that leaned against the wall. He moved it. Beneath it, half buried in the grass and soil at the base of the shed's eastern wall, was a post. Old wood, weathered gray, nearly the same color as the soil around it. It had sunk partially into the ground, and the grass had grown up around it. And the shed wall had been built or extended at some point to cover it, whether deliberately or through the gradual expansion of the shed's footprint over the years, was a question that would require more research than this moment allowed. 2 letters were carved into the wood near the top of the post. CD. Sam said the post was a corner marker. He said CD was the notation used in Monroe County land surveys prior to 1960 for a boundary corner point, established by a deed description, rather than a physical measurement. A corner deed, a reference to the language in the original grant, rather than a surveyor's calculated point. He said posts like this one were placed when a property was first described in legal terms, and were intended to remain in place as permanent reference markers. He said he had compared the position of this post against the original deed description for the Stone Creek parcel. He said the eastern boundary, as described in Harold Marsh's deed, ran from this corner point north to the county road, not 40 feet south of this point. From this point, Craig Donner was looking at the post. Sam said that a strip of land approximately 40 feet wide and running the full length of the eastern boundary had been treated as belonging to the Marsh family property, collectively meaning in practice to Glenn Marsh for a period he estimated at 15 years based on the documentation he had reviewed. He said he had found a timber harvest contract dated 2010, covering acreage that included this strip, and a grazing agreement dated 2015 covering the same area. Both contracts listed the contracting party as Glenn Marsh. Neither piece of land was Glenn Marsh's to contract. The strip ran along the eastern edge of the Stone Creek parcel. It abutted the boundary closest to Ridgeline's upper tract. It included a portion of the access corridor that any development agreement would require. Frank Dolan said treatment isn't title, Mr. Marsh. He said it without emphasis, without satisfaction. Simply and clearly the way he said everything, because it was the accurate thing to say. Glenn was looking at the post in the ground. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he believed was safely buried. Not fear exactly. Not shame exactly. Something older than either of those, the particular exposure of a person who has built an understanding of the world on a foundation that has just been shown to others exactly as it is. Colt was looking at his father, not with anger. Edna had expected anger, the flash and heat of a young man betrayed. And it was not that. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. It was the expression of a person revising something fundamental. The way you revise a sentence when you find the word you chose does not mean what you thought it meant. He stepped away from his father and came to stand near Edna. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She looked at him once, and then she looked back at Glenn. Glenn said this has been marshland. Dolan said Harold Marsh's land. Now Edna Marsh's land. Yes. Glenn said, his voice lower now, the performance gone out of it, leaving only the flat, diminished sound of a man speaking into a space where what he expected to find is not there. You don't understand what you're holding on to, Edna said. Then explain it to me. He did not. Craig Donner had stepped back from the group. He was looking at his rolled documents with the expression of a man reviewing a contract. He has been told represents one thing and his finding represents another. He looked up from the documents to Edna. He said, Mrs. Marsh, I want to be clear about something. She looked at him. He said that Ridgeline had engaged with this property based on representations made to them about the availability and terms of access. He said he would not characterize those representations in the present company and at this moment. He said that whatever those representations were, they were not made by the property owner of record, and that any legitimate discussion of access to the Stone Creek parcel would need to begin with her, under her terms, with her legal counsel present. He said he was sorry for the confusion. He said it to Edna, not to Glenn, not to Patrice. Patrice started to say something. Glenn looked at her and she stopped. Ruth said quietly to no one in particular that the November air had gotten cold and that standing still in a field was not improving things for anyone. Craig Donner gathered his documents. He said he would be in contact through Frank Dolan's office. He shook Dolan's hand, and then he held his hand out to Edna, and she shook it. He looked at Glenn briefly, and then he walked to his truck. Glenn stood for a moment longer. He looked at the shed. He looked at the post. He looked at the slope where the orange flags still stood in the grass, marking the old road. He looked at all of it, the way a man looks at a country he thought he knew, and is discovering he misread the map. Then he looked at Edna. He said nothing. He walked to his truck, and Patrice followed him, and the young man from the SUV, who had never been introduced, followed them both, and the three vehicles went out through the gate one after another and turned north on Stone Creek Road and were gone. The field was quiet. Sam was writing on his clipboard. Ruth was pulling her gloves back on. Frank Dolan was checking something on his phone. Colt was standing near the shed with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the middle distance. Edna looked at the post in the ground. The two carved letters. The old wood that had been there longer than the shed beside it. Longer than any of the present disagreement. Simply marking a line that had been established and recorded and left to hold the boundary of things the way boundaries are supposed to hold. She said to Dolan, "What happens now?" He said, "Now nothing happens until you decide what you want to discuss and on what terms." She nodded. She looked at Craig Donner's card in her hand, and then at the folder she had brought outside with her, the one with her name on it, the one whose contents she now knew completely. She knew what she would and would not agree to. She had known since she finished reading the 6th page the previous night. The weeks that followed were not quiet, but they were orderly. There were letters from Dolan's office and from Ridgeline's attorneys. There were phone calls she took at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of her, and Harold's notes visible at the top. The pages she returned to when she needed to remember that she was not navigating this alone, that someone had already done the thinking and left her the map. She met with Craig Donner twice, both times in Frank Dolan's office in Claiborne, both times with Sam Briggs's survey documentation on the table and the conservation easement recording right beside it. Craig Donner was a professional man and a careful one, and he adjusted to changed circumstances without requiring the adjustment to be dramatized. He had a project that needed an access corridor. She had an access corridor that could be made available under the right conditions. The conditions were hers to set. She said the spring and the lower pasture surrounding it were not negotiable. The conservation easement held, and she would not modify it. And that was not a starting position for a conversation. It was the end of that particular conversation before it began. She said the old road could be restored to a passable standard, and she specified what passable standard meant, which was the standard Sam Briggs outlined in the engineering document. He prepared for her not the standard ridgelines contractors would find most economical. She said the eastern boundary strip, the 40 feet that Glenn had used for 15 years, as though it belonged to him, was to be formally acknowledged as part of her parcel in any agreement, and that any income generated from activities on that strip during the years of its unauthorized use was a matter her attorney would address separately with the appropriate parties. Dolan addressed it. The resolution of that matter was private and took 3 months, and she did not discuss it publicly. But when it was finished, she had enough additional resources to address the deferred maintenance on the house without touching the ridgeline agreement at all. She said the timber on the upper acreage would be assessed by a qualified forester, not Ridgeline's forester, and that any harvest plan would be approved by her before work began and would prioritize the long-term health of the stand over short-term extraction value. She had read enough of Harold's notes to know what questions to ask and what answers were acceptable. Craig Donner agreed to each condition. He had a project that needed a road. She had the only road that worked. The math was not complicated once the sentiment was removed from it. She signed nothing until Dolan had read it 3 times and explained each clause to her in plain language, and she had read it herself twice after that. She asked questions until she understood the answers. She took the time she needed. She told no one how long it took her to feel certain, but she made sure she was certain before she signed. The work on the house began in January. A crew came on a Monday morning, 3 men in a white truck, and they started with the roof, because a roof that holds is the beginning of everything else a house can be. She watched them from the kitchen with her coffee and the blue mug and the calendar on the wall that she had replaced with a new one. Same utility company, different. Tennessee landscape. But she had kept the old one in the drawer where Harold's notes lived, because the handwriting in the squares was still hers, and it still remembered something she was not ready to put away. The roof took 4 days. The porch took 2 more. The furnace was replaced before the worst of the winter arrived, which in Monroe County could arrive without much announcement and stay longer than anyone planned for. She did not renovate the kitchen. She saw no reason to. The layout was practical, and she knew where everything was, and the chipped blue mug looked right where it had always sat beside the sink in the particular angle of morning light that came through the east window and made the chip on the rim look almost deliberate, almost like a feature someone had planned. She kept Harold's calendar in the drawer. She replaced the locks on both doors, the front and the back and the shed, with hardware that required a key that only she had, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. The shed she kept locked. She went into it regularly now to pull the folders and review what needed reviewing, to add notes of her own to the ones Harold had left to sit on the old wooden stool near the door when she needed to think in a space that was quiet and closed and held the particular atmosphere of a place where important things had been kept safe. It was not comfortable and it was not beautiful, and she did not need it to be either of those things. It was hers, and it was private, and it remembered things the way a good place remembers. Patrice came alone on a Friday afternoon in late February. Edna saw the silver SUV from the kitchen window when it turned into the drive, and she set down the document she had been reading and waited. She did not go to the door immediately. She let the car park. She let Patrice get out and stand for a moment looking at the house, at the new roof, at the repaired porch, at the front door. The front door was blue. Edna had painted it herself in the first warm week of January, working in short sessions because the cold came and went, and you took the windows of good weather when they arrived. She had painted it a deep, particular blue, not the tentative blue of something that wants to appear blue and is afraid of commitment, but the blue of something that knows what it is and has decided. She watched Patrice look at it. Then she went to the door. Patrice stood on the porch with her purse held in both hands, and without the young man from the SUV, and without Glenn, and without the particular composure she maintained so reliably in groups, she looked smaller. Without an audience, not in stature, but in some quality that Edna had always understood, was partly performance, the confidence that comes from being observed and knowing how to be observed. She was not performing now. She said, "I misjudged things." 3 words, not an apology in the full sense of the word, not the kind that addresses years or acknowledges specific acts, or offers anything beyond the acknowledgement itself. But it was honest in the way that Patrice had rarely been honest with her, which was to say directly and without the protective layer of implication. Edna looked at her for a moment. She said, "Yes, you did." Patrice's face moved, just briefly. The slight, involuntary shift of someone who hears a true thing and absorbs it. She had perhaps expected more, or perhaps less, or perhaps something other than the calm and simple agreement with which Edna received her 3 words. They stood on the porch for a while. Patrice said something about Glenn, something carefully worded that managed to both distance herself from his actions and not quite condemn them, the linguistic equivalent of standing at the edge of a thing without committing to a position. Edna listened and did not offer the scaffolding that Patrice was reaching for. Then Patrice said that Colt had told them both what he had done, that he had called Edna. She said this without apparent anger, with something that might have been resignation, or might have been relief at not having to carry the pretense of it anymore. Edna said Colt had done the right thing. Patrice said she supposed he had. She stayed perhaps 15 minutes. She did not ask to come inside. Edna did not offer. They stood on the porch with the February air between them and the view of the yard that was tidier than it had been in years, the weeds cut back from the fence line, the gate hanging straight, the drive raked clean of the season's accumulations. When Patrice turned to go, she paused at the top of the porch steps and looked once more at the blue door. She said Harold would have liked that color. Edna did not answer. She watched Patrice walk to the SUV and get in and back carefully out of the drive. and turned south on Stone Creek Road. She watched until the silver vehicle was gone around the bend in the trees. Then she stood on the porch alone for a while. She did not feel triumphant. She had thought she might, and she did not. What she felt was something steadier and quieter than triumph, more like the particular settledness that arrives when a long uncertainty resolves not with drama, but with the gradual accumulation of small clarities. Until one day you look at where you are standing and you understand that you are not waiting for something to begin. You are in the middle of something that has already begun and is going well. She went back inside and finished her coffee. By March, the yard was different, not transformed, not made into something it was not. Changed in the way things change when they are tended rather than managed, when someone is present with genuine attention, rather than passing through with a plan. She had cleared the weeds from the fence line herself in sessions of an hour or two, working in the mornings when the light was good and the ground was soft. She had found beneath 20 years of growth along the east fence a row of old iris bulbs that must have been planted by someone who lived in the house before Harold. Someone whose name was not in any document she had found, but whose preference for iris in March had survived them. They had come up yellow. Ruth Colby brought biscuits on the first morning they bloomed and stood at the gate and said, "Looks like it knows who owns it now." Edna looked at the house, the blue door, the roof without its patches, the porch without its lean, the yard with its recovered fence line and its resurrected iris, and the path behind the house that led past the shed and down the slope to where the orange flags still stood in the grass, though they were weathered now and would need to be replaced before the survey work resumed in spring. She thought about Harold writing those pages in his folder. She thought about him calling Dolan from the hospital with the particular stubbornness of a man who understood that the things he still needed to do were more important than the things he was comfortable doing. She thought about him pressing his name to the conservation easement document with a hand that was not as steady as it had once been, and trusting that the document would do its work after he could not. He had not been a sentimental man. He had been a thorough one. There was a difference, and it mattered. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window with the chipped blue mug in both hands, and looked through the glass at the slope behind the house, at the old road that was no longer hidden at the spring in the lower pasture, that was moving over its stones, the way it always moved, patient and cold and clean, indifferent to everything that had been said above it in the past 4 months, belonging to itself before it belonged to anyone on paper. The iris were yellow in the morning light along the fence. The door was the right blue. The land ran back to the ridge the way it had always run, holding what it held, remembering what it remembered, keeping the account of itself in the way that land keeps accounts in water and stone, and the compressed record of everything that has lived on it and worked it and been honest enough to deserve it. Edna Marsh set her coffee down on the counter beside the blue mug and looked at the window and the yard and the slope and the tree line and the ridge beyond. She was not waiting to be welcomed here. She was already home, and the land had known her name for a long time.